Hey there everybody, it's Nathan Cool, and in this episode I want to cover some basic color grading when you're doing real estate videos. Now this is going to expand a little bit on my book, Basic Videography for Real Estate, where in there I show that for a lot of real estate videos you don't have to go to a high expense, you don't have to go to a massive production, you can still achieve something that's very good yet very acceptable for a lot of times what will be a temporary video asset. This will help you take that a step further. In the book, I do talk about some of the basics that you can use, like using Premiere Pro, but I want to show you some real world examples. It's this video here, for instance. Now that's just a small segment of the entire video, and we used some drone. We used, then I did a gimbal outside using a Nikon Z6, and I'll cover some of that also on some of the settings that allows us to get a little bit of a wider dynamic range, gives us some more editing flexibility, things that I also mentioned throughout the book. But then what happens when you take it into Premiere Pro, because some of this will need some special color editing. Now it's commonly called color grading. Technically that's not the correct term always, because when you're color grading you're actually working on changing some of the color between gradients of the tonal range. But here anyways it's commonly called color grading. It's the editing. What do we do? You might be used to doing this in Lightroom, changing highlights and whites and blacks, some of the saturations, some of those things. So real world examples, what do we come across when we're using drone, when I'm doing gimbal work outside, and then also inside on some of the more problematic areas. So want to cover some of that, some before and after examples as well, and then at the end I'll show the entire video. You ready to get started and see how this is done? Let's go. So here we are in Premiere Pro. Everything has been loaded up. You can see this is a fully edited video here. And what I want to do is go through the various segments to show what we're up against with some of this editing. So a lot of this will be when you're in color mode, which I show up here. So technically, or typically when you're putting this together, you'll be in the edit mode like this. And that's fine for a lot of the work that you'd be doing. And it gives you a lot of the tools that you would need to do some of the effects and whatnot if you were to select a video, and some of the different things that you could do for the effects controls on it and whatnot. But after you get the whole video lined up and how you like it, and you can see that everything's working good, it's being timed to the music, you know, if you like, that's all fine. But now we have to worry about the color of it. So let's go over here to the color module. This is using the Lumetri color module in Premiere Pro, comes standard with it. If I turn the color off on this, you can see this is kind of flat coming out of the drone. Even though this was 4K video footage coming out of the DJI, it's still just always a little bit flat. So what I like to do is then pump that up a little bit. So over here, these are some of the typical settings. So this was done on a very bright day, so I wanted to bring down the highlights a little bit, bring the shadows up. So bringing up the shadows to about there, that tends to lighten certain areas. A little bit of whites in this case because of some of the dull colors I want to bring out. And then the saturation stayed at about 100. Blacks went down to try to richen it up. But something else I could have done here, and I did a little bit of it, is I could have gone more is on vibrance and then saturation in the creative module. Notice here in the basic module, I've got highlights, I've got shadows, and that's fine. And I do have saturation. But I can get more control out of saturation for a lot of these exterior shots if I go to creative. The reason being is that vibrance is different from saturation, and this applies to all editing software, photos and also video, where vibrance uses an algorithm to find the muted colors and then up the saturation on that. So if we were to start out with saturation, it would typically be at just 100, and the vibrance here would be much lower, and that would be at 0. So if we started out with that, what I'd want to first do is if I can bring out some vibrance in these colors first, especially the sky, I want to do that first so that it doesn't interfere with saturation. So I can bring that vibrance up as much as I want. You can see that's way too much. But if I bring up that color and then start bringing up the saturation after that, then I get something that's definitely richer, definitely more rich than that. So I'll turn that off, turn that back on, you can see the difference. So let's see the whole video segment on this particular one. This is what it looked like before, and then of course after the color grading. So now that we've got that, I would apply some of that to a lot of these other settings. Now, what you can do to make this easier on yourself is when you're working on a segment here, I can zoom in on that, you can right click on it and then you can go to copy. When you go to then another clip, like on this one, you can then right click on it and you can say paste attributes. And here it knew that I could select and apply then the Lumetri color. If there were other things that I did, they would show up these check boxes. And then of course, you would select OK if you wanted to apply that to here. Too much for this particular one, which we can see it's a little bit too rich because we're at a lower altitude and we're capturing less of that muted sandy color in the hills. Let me just back off some of that up here. I could go back to the basic correction and do the same thing. So that's fine. So these are some of the easy things, and this is now when I'm doing the gimbal on the with the Z6. This was drone stuff done with my drone partner, Jonathan, the drone guy. When I do the Z6 gimbal stuff here, like on this, yeah, I've got some colors going on, a little bit of strange stuff. Let me turn off to show you what I mean. So this is without Lumetri color on. You can see that I'm trying to get a balance of some shadows, but it's way too bright. This is up near the high desert, so it's very, very sunny. And even though I use the go-to settings that I talk about in the book, which was at about, what was this? It'd be using f11, ISO 100, 1/25 of a second, and it's still just a little too bright. So that's not a problem. You can see that when I turned on Lumetri color, I brought the highlights way down. So bringing those highlights down really got rid of a lot of that glare. It was also though so contrasty because this was near in the fall, so we got a lower horizon sun. So a lot of shadows. So I brought the shadows up on that. The other thing too is that while recording this is where I took advantage of using a lighting optimizer. And this is something that I talk about throughout the book, where instead of shooting in an S-log format or some type of log format, which also might require an external monitor, an easy way to do this is to utilize something that you can find in just about every camera. In Nikon, it's known as active D-lighting. Canon calls it auto lighting optimizer. Sony calls it dynamic range optimizer. And these lighting optimizers will then they'll take this balance of shadows and highlights and get you a better dynamic range. This happened to be, because I knew this would be very contrasty, this was at about high on the active D-lighting on the Nikon Z6. Now that got me a good dynamic range, but then at the same time I needed to then still decrease the highlights and increase the shadows on that. So no saturation here. If we go to the creative module, you can see I did want to increase the vibrance. Saturation wasn't touched. Reason being is that I don't want to really saturate everything, but I want to bring out vibrance in the muted colors. You can see if I go too far, that's what's going to happen. I'm going to get the muted colors. Even up here, we've got a green cast. I'm going to talk a little bit about that next. So bringing up just a little bit of vibrance now on this, then I can see that I'm bringing out some vibrance in the sky. But if I go back, if I want to get real picky with this, I can see that there's a little bit of green tint that's showing up here. So that'll be more visible when I get to the next segment, which is doing a pan from this side. Now, similar to the last segment, I lowered the highlights a little bit. This is from a different angle, so I didn't have the same type of glaring sun out of it. But I could have brought down the highlights maybe a little bit more. I could have also brought up the shadows just a tad. But it really did have enough saturation in it, so I really didn't feel like this needed to be changed. But if I go over here to vibrance, and excuse me on that, it did up the saturation just a little bit to 107. But if I go back here to here where I wanted vibrance, if I started increasing vibrance here, I might bring out a little bit of a richer sky, and that would be acceptable, but I'm also starting to richen up a lot of the house. And because this house, it's actually yellow, it's in shade, you can see though some of that is very yellowish looking. And I've also got some strange tints up here. Not bad on the green. If I wanted to bring that green down a little bit, this is very rare that I do it, but you can use these color wheels. And in here, that's shadows, and this is true color grading here using the color wheel, something that's been new to Lightroom that they added. I could go to the shadows here and say, okay, take those greens and start. I'm going to drag that over here into the blues and reds. And that takes then any greens that were in shadows and puts them in that range. Same with the midtones. I could take those midtone greens and start cooling those out. So that helped a little bit. We turn that off and on. And then if we go ahead and play the before and after segments, this is what it looks like. Okay, so those are some of the options when we're outside. A lot of stuff here too, when we're talking about the outside footage, you can see like on this segment, I brought the highlights down because this was very glary. So there's really, besides that, not much else besides a little bit of saturation. Those are easy. This is the outside stuff, not a whole lot of changes that have to do and worry about anything on that. When we go to the inside though, things get trickier. So let's take a look at something inside. After we've done all this outside stuff, we're all happy with it. The inside, it gets a little bit trickier. Here's a transition into the to the inside. Once I'm inside, then of course, if you've ever done this before, you know this is where things just get really, really tough. We can see from here, if I turn off Lumetri color, there's some glary stuff. Some of the color was a little bit off, but I'm going to show you an even tougher example. One of the things that I like to do is when it's a property like this is to really emphasize that your outside rocks. I mean, this is where we want most of the footage. That's why we're selling drone. We're doing a lot of then the footage outside to show all these amenities. And that then really gives them a really good video of some of the better selling points, because also inside doing video is going to be really tough. And there's no sense in using just stills throughout this if you're duplicating the process. But there is a case for that. First, let me just show you something here. I'm going through, I'm just dragging this along. The idea was I'm walking backwards, I'm panning through to show the main living area, do a transition though to one of the stills I took. So this then, because it's such a selling feature, having that wall of glass basically that looks out to the outside, really felt it was needed here. But to try to help out with that, what I did here on this particular video is you can see I decreased the highlights on this. Now, this was using Nikon's active D lighting, one of those lighting optimizers. Once again, Canon and Sony have them also, to where I had it on high. So it is reducing the highlights, it is increasing the shadows before burning this in to the MP4 that was saved out of camera. So that does help. But besides here, I really don't want a lot of saturation. I don't want a lot of color. So one of the tricks I do, you can see here's what it looked like before and here's what it looks like with it. I decrease the saturation just a tad down here. And yeah, normally it would be right about at 100, right about here. But by decreasing it just a little bit, we take out a lot of the color cast. So I'm going to show you a better example of that in just a little bit. Sometimes things work really well, especially if you're shooting away from the windows. Here's a segment where I just use the joystick on the gimbal to just do a pan down. And there's a little bit of red cast that's going on. I don't care about the highlights being blown out that far away. Plus what I was really concentrating on here was the selling feature of look at this beam's feeling, look where it is, you know, from the top. So here, I didn't really feel that it needed any, so there was no color grading on this segment at all. That changes though when we get into this one. In this segment here, this is just really tough. Let's take a look at the before on this, and this is what I was up against. And you can see there's a lot of green cast that's coming in off the ceiling on this. And if I zoom in on here to 100%, so you can see on that, you can see, yeah, there's a lot of green cast on the ceiling. There's orange cast on the ceiling over here. So what do you do with it? This is most of the times one of the hardest and most difficult areas of color grading videos. So what I did to fix it up like this, you can see I did, once again, I'm recording with the active D lighting at high. So my lighting optimizer is really reducing the highlights and upping shadows. And here I reduce the highlights even more. I increased the shadows quite a bit, increased the whites, and decreased the blacks. The blacks help me richen it. The whites help me to brighten it a little bit, but by moving the white point on that. Another thing I did too is I changed the color temperature. So even though I was setting white balance as I went along and doing it all manual, where it was before, I still had it too warm. I just could not find a good white balance while I was working with it. So I went ahead and cooled it down a little bit. It was right about there. And then once again, just like I showed in the last clip, 2 clips ago, where I'm getting color cast, well, I just add some desaturation to that. So if I had it all the way saturated, I got a lot of color casts all over. So a lot of times by just reducing the saturation a bit, you can get that out of there. Here, there was nothing that needed to be done on creative because I don't want to richen up the colors, and I really only use creative for some of these things. Now, you can think that, well, now we can use our color wheels on some of this. Take the highlights, get the green out of the highlights, and you might be able to do that by dragging some of this. But what will happen is all the highlights are going to start turning toward that color. So you can see I'm getting too much of a shift in that. No matter what I do, I really can't seem to be getting rid of green without throwing that off too much. And one of the other problems too that you're up against is anytime you start doing color grading, we'll try to move this back into the center, is that you're changing everything globally. Yes, there are masks, but don't forget we're moving. So let's take a quick look at before and after on this particular video segment. Okay, so that's just about it. There's a couple other things though, just to cover real quick. Here's another example. Now I'm shooting not necessarily toward the windows as much, but still here I needed to change the highlights. So this is what it looked like before. Now, one of the things I did with this having the active D-lighting at high, the lighting optimizer at high, I'm getting some view to the outside. I know that while I'm exposing, so I know that when I'm in post-processing, once I do some of these changes by lowering the highlights, increasing the shadows, that's going to look pretty good. Once you do that, by the way, you have to bring back detail, and that's almost always why blacks are brought down, and sometimes you have to add contrast to it. So it's a balancing act trying to get rid of that. Here, I didn't really have as much color cast, so I didn't worry about the saturation as much. Here, I could have probably lowered the saturation a tad and got rid of a little bit of color cast, but then I would have really wanted to richen the colors up by using some of the black. So I didn't really need to do that as much for this particular one. So that went through the rest of the video. There was other segments here that required similar adjustments. This didn't have as much glary stuff, so lowering the highlights a little bit and upping the shadows, changing some of the white balance helped a little bit on that. But of course then, the tough part with this segment is here I start going in, here's my shadow. I don't really care about that stuff. You can see that if I go into this bedroom, I'm going to have to do some type of exposure transition like I show in the book. But it's just going to be too difficult. And since this is really just a small trailer for everything inside, not trailer as a house, but trailer as a teaser type of video, I did a transition to one of the stills that I had taken earlier when I did the photos. Now, I'm not doing this for every single shot, but for instance, when I start working toward the bathroom, so I go over here for this video segment, I could go into the bathroom, but I don't. I just go ahead and transition into one of the stills that I took. And I think about not just the stills, but the video segments. As I'm setting up the shot, I know that I can transition to a photo that I took previously. Typically, I like to shoot the photos first and then do the videos second. So as I know, it's like, well, okay, I can grab that one shot that I just took and I'll just transition into that. Then the rest of this did just a lot of exterior color grading. That's how we ended out the video, to once again show this was a 5-acre property and had a lot to show more outside than inside. So once again, you can see here I'm lowering the highlights, I'm upping the shadows. When I get to the creative module, then there's more vibrance that has been added. So before and after on this glary flat, fixed, not as glary on that. Okay, and then finishing up the video, that's when getting to things like the pool, really want to have some good colors out of that. So typically I would add a lot more saturation, but in this case, it just turned out really good straight out of camera. And the point being is that you don't always have to be pushing your editing. When you're outside and you're using a good camera profile in your camera and your lighting optimizer is set very well, a lot of times you don't need to. With this being so glary, this used the active D-lighting at low. So where some of the other shots, especially inside, were at high, this was kept at low, and I'm not really worried about shadows in the distance at the house because the highlight here is the pool and also getting a sun flare near the end, so that was kind of impactful. And then of course we just ended out the video here. Another piece of drone footage, and you can see here upping the shadows, upping the whites in the basic correction, and also upping the saturation a little bit. And in the creative module, nothing really was needed because that saturation took care of enough of it with this particular segment as we started going out. So let's take a look at the whole thing from start to finish. Here we go. Well, I hope this video was useful for you and that you can use some of this in your work as well. If you did like this video and you want to see more, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. It won't cost anything, and as soon as one of these videos is posted, you'll be the first to know. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time, take care, be safe, and get out there and shoot something.